Yes, totally. And I think that there are different approaches that are more successful in either places. Like, I would say in general, while YouTube can definitely grow to be like a really like relational platform of people when they subscribe to you watching every single one of your videos, that does happen, but it's going to be with a very small percentage of your viewership ultimately.
Would you recommend to somebody that they teach content differently based on whether they decide to start a YouTube channel versus a podcast? Like, I mean, to me, I always think about like for so many of my customers and so many of the listeners who are in like the health and wellness or food space, I'm always like, well, like YouTube seems to make sense to me because if it were me, I'd be doing a lot of like visual stuff. Like it's a very visual thing. So I would probably be doing lots of like little cooking demos and recipe stuff. And I don't know, like to workout tips or whatever. That seems to make sense to me on YouTube. But yeah, how do you like counsel people to kind of break down the different types or the way that they approach content based on which platform they choose?
Totally, because I feel like different niches can lend themselves more well to different platforms. That being said, a lot of stuff, like you could have a podcast and a YouTube channel about the exact same thing and they could be
Yeah.
very successful. So I think it's all about the way that you approach it. So I think for one, it can be about, again, like I talked about, like, what are you kind of excited about doing? Like, even if you are like a food or like a health coach, if you're not excited about filming food
Mm.
videos, then you kind of have to be realistic with yourself and say, if I'm not actually going to sit down and film when I need to do that, but I will sit down and like record a really in-depth podcast, like maybe that is where I should go. So it's not always about like, oh, what type of content, but I do think that looking at where your niche kind of has the biggest audience, that can be a helpful guide. Because, yeah, like I was saying, video or audio, there's great ways to do that no matter what the subject matter. But if you find that your niche has a really strong community on YouTube, then it might be worth getting on YouTube. But if you find that, oh, actually, like my kind of people, they love listening to podcasts, maybe I should create a podcast. So I feel like it's kind of more about where your audience really likes to spend time, where
Mm.
your community is, and then also your own inclinations in terms of like, do I like video editing or do I like audio editing or whatever? Because I really do believe that there's creative ways to represent a niche well, whether it's in a
Hmm.
podcast or a YouTube video.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. That's how I felt about what I'm doing. Like I don't mind doing video and I think like for me it feels more natural to go to YouTube and do more like tip heavy type stuff. And then the podcast, although I do tips, it does feel more like intimate and conversational where I feel like I get different messages from people about podcast episodes like they really like emotionally connected with something, whereas I feel like with YouTube I get lots of like people reaching out saying that something was helpful, more like that tip was really helpful, that kind of thing. Yeah, and
Yeah,
it's because
I
I approach them differently.
Yes, totally. And I think that there are different approaches that are more successful in either places. Like, I would say in general, while YouTube can definitely grow to be like a really like relational platform of people when they subscribe to you watching every single one of your videos, that does happen, but it's going to be with a very small percentage of your viewership ultimately. YouTube tends to be, especially when you are an educator of some variety, like
Mm.
if you are answering those questions that people are typing into search, it's going to be a little bit more transactional. A lot of your
Mm.
audience is going to come get the answer and then, they've received it. And, a small percentage will convert to being those loyal fans if they really connect with your personality. Whereas I think with podcasts, it tends to be a little bit more relational than transactional
Hmm.
because I think when people start listening to a podcast, they're kind of in it for the long run. And I think part of that is because it's a little bit harder to find new podcasts in a way. Like there is like the whole like, Apple Podcast Explore page or whatever. But a lot of people tend to find podcasts through sometimes search, sometimes like word of mouth, like recommendations. But once you've listened to one episode, like you've invested, let's say like an hour or whatever, like you've probably really come to know and trust the host. And so you're going to listen again. So it kind of becomes a little bit more relational, if that makes sense. Whereas on YouTube, just because it's like shorter form content, it's so easy to click away onto something else.
Mm.
It feels a little bit more transactional that way. So not that it can't become like a longer term relationship like I was saying, but I do think because of that just slight difference of, when people are sitting watching a YouTube video, they see your video, but they also see like 10 other videos in the sidebar that they could click on. Whereas if they're listening to your podcast, like people listening right now, they might be like doing the dishes or folding laundry or going on a run or whatever. So they're not as apt to like click away because their phone's like in their pocket or something. They're
Yeah.
doing something else. So I think it kind of just builds that more long-term relationship, whereas YouTube is just a little bit more like, there's billboards for all kinds of other content all in front of your eyes. size that you could just easily click away to. So because of that, it just lends itself to a different style of delivery, and then also like slightly different kind of relationship patterns from your viewers.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it feels like that's such a good point that on YouTube there's so many things happening, and primarily people are consuming it either through their phone, but probably more so even their computer. And there are just so many distractions there. And I feel like you have to work really hard on YouTube to like keep people's attention, keep them watching. Whereas a podcast just feels like you said, it's like an investment. Like I'm already in this. If I've listened
Yeah,
for like 40 minutes, I'm not like clicking over to somebody else's thing by now. Yeah. So that
exactly.
that makes sense.